Well, thank you for coming today to the third installment of our Education 101 policy series. With this year having been declared the year of education, we just thought it was very, very important to share some best practices and some good information from experts both locally and around the country. Just to kind of recap where we've been in our journey, we started with talking about how administrative spending is really squeezing money out of the classroom, both in terms of the staffing surge that we've seen here in South Carolina and across the country in non-teaching staff, as well as in some of our rural communities that are experiencing small and shrinking student populations, and thus the need for consolidation, which is one of the things that was addressed in Speaker Lucas's bill. Our second event looked at education scholarship accounts and the kind of transformation that could be for education delivery for some of the neediest students in our state. And then today we're going to talk about education finance. Of course, y'all may have heard about the bill that the Speaker passed, Omnibus Education Bill. I mean, somebody was talking about that somewhere. But next year we anticipate that there will be an education finance companion piece to that policy piece. And so this is our attempt to bring you up to speed on some of the education finance discussions that have been happening here in South Carolina as well as across the country. We have some great experts that you'll hear from today. Matthew Joseph, who is from the Foundation for Excellence in Education. We have Dr. Rebecca Gunlickson, who many of you all are familiar with her work previously at the Department of Commerce and now with her own firm, Acuitas Economics. And then we have Mary Carmichael, a longtime friend from the charter school community, who's now executive principal at a school in Charleston and was former director of the South Carolina Public Charter School Alliance. Just three words that I'd like to leave you with to kind of frame this discussion as we think about education finance. We started working on this issue probably about 2 years ago with Dr. Gunlickson as we started to notice more and more that you can't get policy right until you get the finance structure right. And South Carolina's finance structure is pretty broken, as you will hear today. But there are three key words that I think are takeaways to really frame this discussion as we think about how to get education finance right. The first is autonomy, or another way of putting that might be flexibility. And that principle is let's get as much money as possible, as close to the student as possible. Let's allow principals to be CEOs of their schools, and let's allow teachers to be CEOs of their classrooms. So we need flexibility in finance. But along with that flexibility has to come accountability, or maybe the better word for that is expectations. We have to have fair, transparent expectations of what we want our students to learn. I kind of think of it as an evolution of the term public education. Public education should not just be a system. It should be our end goal, which is an educated public. And so thinking about that in terms of the accountability of what we expect from our students. And then, of course, the third word that we always talk about in this discussion is equity. A lot of times we think about equity in terms of urban versus rural, but today, as you'll hear, we have a lot of inequities in terms of how we treat different types of students within the public system, charter versus traditional versus online. And so there are a number of ways of looking at equity that may go a little bit beyond the traditional discussion that we typically have around that. So with those three thoughts in mind as kind of framework, I will go ahead and turn it over to Matthew Joseph to present some findings from a paper that he has actually just published hot off the presses. It is now on the Palmetto Promise website, and you can pick up a copy on your way out. Matthew.
Thank you, Ellen. It's great to be here. And thank you for the opportunity to talk to you a little bit about the work that we've done in looking at how South Carolina funds its education. Excel and Ed, we are a nonprofit organization. We work across the country with state policymakers who are pursuing education changes. We work in a vast majority of the states, and so I get a chance to kind of have contact with a lot of the way states are funding their education. My first exposure to South Carolina was I saw like a chart that had like circles for all the different funding streams, and each circle was a different size, I guess, depending upon how much money was associated with it, and it looked like this intricate spider web across these two slides. And I said to myself, I hope I never have to learn the way South Carolina does its education funding, because that chart just blew me away. And over the last few months of learning and studying the South Carolina system, I'm equally kind of going back to that initial concern, which is that this is one of the most complex funding structures in any state in the country, and there are real implications for having such a complicated funding system for schools and for students, such that they don't really know how much money they're getting or why, and no one really understands like the method behind the madness. And so, we're going to be talking a little bit about some of the solutions, but this study kind of looks at how is it currently funded and how does that stack up with what we consider to be a state-of-the-art funding system, which we call student-centered funding. So this is just the summary of what I'll go into a little more detail, where we looked to see of the funding in South Carolina, how much of that funding is what we would call student-centered. And I'm going to define student-centered, which means how much of that funding is going out to districts and schools based on the number of students they're serving and the types of students they're serving. And the biggest finding we had was that almost 60%, 58% of the funding in South Carolina is not going out to districts and schools on that basis. And that holds, it's even more so in some districts, which I'll give you some examples of that. And it's similarly true for charter schools, and we'll go into a little more detail about that. But I'll be explaining a little more about this contrast between Richland 1 and Sumter in a minute. So just to kind of take a step back in terms of understanding what student-centered funding is, what that is, that gold standard for funding schools and students across the country. Student-centered funding means that the districts and schools are getting their money based on how many students they serve and the type of student. So every district and school is receiving the same base funding amount for their typical student. Then they're getting some additional funds based on students who have advantages, disadvantages, or special needs. That's oftentimes called weights because it's a multiplier of the base funding, so some people call it weighted student funding. The third principle is that all districts and schools are getting the same funding. They're getting it through that same funding formula. The fourth is that some small but meaningful part of the funding is based on performance. It's based on how schools are actually doing, so that they are incentivized to innovate and they're rewarded for success. And Ellen just talked about this one of these things about student-centered funding is that an inherent feature of it, it gives schools and districts a lot of flexibility on how they use their resources, but they're going to be held accountable, and they're also going to be given a lot of information so they can then compare themselves to others. Are there other schools in my district, in my state, that I think of as similar but are actually doing better for less results, for less resources? Some of the benefits of student-centered funding, just to go over really quickly, is the transparency. I mean, there's a simplicity, a basic. You get to see, I serve a certain number of students, I serve a certain type of students, this is why I get the certain amount of money I get. It gives that flexibility that Ellen mentioned that is empowering to the district leaders. They have the flexibility to use those resources to meet the unique needs of their students. It also empowers parents because they're going to have the ability to choose the school in the district that's best for them, and they're not going to have to leave behind a whole bunch of services for their student, their child, if they want to make that decision. The fairness of it, you would see that the same type of student across the state is getting similar resources for them. And then I mentioned the notion of it incentivizing outcomes and success. It does put the state actor in the role of being looser on the inputs because we don't want to prescribe in such an evolving world every single input that should be in a school. We don't want to have them fixated on a model that is 100 years old. We want them to be able to innovate, but we do want to hold them very strong on accountability for outcomes. Just to go quickly, just to summarize the way education is currently in South Carolina, the average spending, the average revenue is $11,850 per student, which is substantially higher than the average for the southeastern states. It's $1,500 higher. So it's not that South Carolina is spending a small amount of money. There is that core formula through the Education Finance Act that is going to be student-centered, but then that spider web I talked about is this whole array of additional funding streams, like 100 of them, which are on top of that core funding. The one thing I also will say, as someone who does this a lot in other states, there's a tremendous lack of transparency. In other states, you can go and you can find out, you can pull down, why is this district getting a certain amount of money? That's not true in South Carolina. You're having to really dig deep if you are trying to understand, and if a district was trying to understand why they're getting the amount of revenue they're getting. And for charter schools, which I know Mary Carmichael will talk about it more, there's even less transparency. It's really hard to figure out if you're the public, a parent, or a policymaker. In terms of the findings of our study, what we did is we took a look at all the local and state dollars that are going out to districts and charter schools in South Carolina and determined how much of that money is student-centered, how much of it is being based on their number of students and the type of their students. And out of that 11,850, the answer was 4,741. So that's less than half. That's 42%. What are some of the main reasons? This is in our report that Ellen mentioned is online. We have copies of it here. There are a lot more details than I can go into right now. But the biggest things are listed here, which is the local funding, the huge amount of local funding that comes outside of the formula that's not based on the number of students. In other words, if you were a district and for some reason a 10% increase in enrollment arrived in your district, you would not get any extra local dollars. It's fixed. The state funding, the money the state gives to districts in lieu of local taxes is also not based on the number of students. It's based on lost local revenue, which means the wealthiest districts are actually getting more money. So it's not based on the number of students. And then there's an array of programs that are based on staffing formulas, number of teachers you have, the salaries of the teachers, the transportation bus routes you have, specific schools, the whole array of things. Each of those funding streams has their own intricate allocation methodology, which is not based on the number of students or the types of students that you serve. And then one thing is that none of this money, this is over $8 billion going out, is tied to performance of the schools. I wanted to just give you an example of two neighboring districts. So these are right next to each other, Richland 1 and Sumter. And I can't go through all the detail, but you'll see for Richland 1, its revenue at the bottom purple there is $15,875. Of that money, only $4,549 is student-centered. That everything else, all those other items, do not in any way go up or down based on the number of students or the type of students they serve. So that means that if they gained a student, they would get that $4,549. They wouldn't get any extra money to serve that student. If a student from Richland 1 went next door, the parents moved to Sumter, of that $15,875 that was being spent on that student, only Sumter would only get an increase of $4,770. That's in that green on the right next to Sumter. So what you see is because so much of the money is locked into districts and schools and programs and staffing positions, there's not flexibility. The districts are not being able to flex based on the number of students they're serving. So this is just a graphic kind of showing the Richland 1 versus Sumter scenario where Richland 1, the amount of student-centered funding is less than a third. So more than 2/3 of their money is not based on the number of students or the types of students they serve. I then wanted to go a little bit and talk about charter schools, and Mary will talk about this a little more. And the one thing I want to say about charter schools, because she's going to give a lot of detail, is that we're looking to see whether or not if a charter school gained a student, would they gain any money? So we're not saying that they're not getting any money. They're clearly getting a lot of money. She'll show you that. But we're saying if there's a funding stream that is not flexing based on the number of students or type of students they have, they're not going to get any money necessarily if a new student, if they get a 10% increase in the number of students. They might get some, but it's going to be quite erratic based on that allocation methodology. So in South Carolina, we had to look at another complex scenario, which is that the different types of charter schools are treated differently. So first you have the state authorized charter schools, and then even among them, the ones that are brick and mortar get treated differently than the virtual. And then we have the locally authorized charter schools, and they get treated differently from the state authorized from a funding perspective. So on the left here, you see how the state authorized brick and mortars get treated, which is of that 11,850 that's going out for the student in the traditional school district, the state authorized brick and mortar is getting 8,300. That means that if they gain a student, instead of getting the $11,850, they would only get an additional $8,300. And the reason is in the middle there, that lack of access to local funding. There is a state supplement that is provided, but it really pales in comparison to the lack of access to the local funding, and they don't get access to the state funding that's going out to pay in lieu of local taxes. They don't get either of those huge blocks of funding. And so the state supplement doesn't even come close to making up for that. And then there's all those other various programs I talked about before, which are based on the type of school, the staffing position. All those things don't flex. So if a charter school gains a student, they're not necessarily going to gain access to that. The virtual state authorized charter schools are doing even worse. If they get an initial student, they're going to gain $6,600 instead of the $11,850. And in terms of the locally authorized, this is where the lack of transparency is really severe, because the way they're supposed to get their money is they're supposed to get money based on the general fund of the authorizing district, so the per pupil general fund. So that's not published information anywhere. So, I had to kind of like pick a few districts and kind of try to understand what that means, because what's happening is that when the districts calculate that, they leave a lot of money off the table. So in the general fund, they have excluded all the funds for all kinds of special purposes. So the locally authorized districts are losing 20 or 30% of the funding just because of the way that calculation gets made. Although, again, there's a lot of lack of transparency. So they're still in a position. And what I wanted to do is show you an example of a situation where we have a traditional district, Buford, and then we have a state-authorized charter school nearby, Bridges Prep, and then we have a locally authorized, Riverview. And you can see that Buford, what their revenue is in that green is $14,391. And then you have Bridges Prep, which is the state-authorized, where they're getting the state core formula, they're getting the state supplement, but they're not getting an increase when that extra student comes. And this is not to say they don't get any money through these line items. It's that, do they get money when that extra student arrives? That's what student-centered mean. No, they're not. So they're really getting, for that extra student, a little over $8,000. The Riverview charter, they're getting that general fund calculation, so they get that $88,165, but they don't get anything else. So they're really not in any different or better situation than the state-authorized charter nearby. In both instances, if a parent wanted to move their child to one of these charter schools, you can see the financial problem, because instead of their child getting $14,000 worth of services, it's going to drop to close to $8,000, and that would be a severe detriment to the parent who wants to do that. That's a detriment to the charter school who's wanting to recruit more students, when if they recruit more students, they're only going to get a fraction of the cost that the other districts were getting for that student. The report kind of talks about like implications and recommendations. Dr. Gunderson is going to be talking about the kind of the basic, why can't South Carolina have a student-centered funding formula? So this is a little more specific than that. I mean, it just basically says, can the state just roll up all that spider web of little dots into a core funding formula? This is what other states have done. Other states have like taken 50 different funding programs and rolled them all up into a simple base plus additional funds for students with special needs or characteristics. The second is with local funding. I mean, when you have a huge amount of local dollars, the question is, how can you make it student-centered? Well, you can incorporate it into the funding formula, and you can also make it adjust up and down automatically for student enrollment, so that if more students arrive into a district, the local funding will automatically go up. The third is that the charter schools, they can just be seamlessly folded into the same funding formula. The states that are doing this well, you don't have to have 3 or 4 or 6 different funding formulas for your charter schools. You can have them treated equally and equitably the way other schools are treated. The fourth thing, and we have a resource about this, is that once this funding hits the district, how can you make sure it actually follows the student? So if you are providing weighted funds for a low-income student, a student with special needs, how can you make sure it actually gets to the school where that student is? And there's a lot of ways state actors and state policymakers can do that. And the fifth thing is to link some money to performance. It doesn't require 50 or 100% of the dollars going to performance. We have a model and some concept papers on our website, Excel and Ed's website, it's referenced to in the report, where if a state even did 5 or 10% of the money based on student learning, it would significantly drive up improvement in student learning in the state. And low income and at-risk students would particularly benefit from that. And so we provide like a model to help state policymakers understand, well, how could I do that without having some kind of unpredictable nature of funding in the state? And the answer is there's a lot of ways that that can be done, and it would result in improved outcomes and efficiency. So I think, our conclusion is that when you have a funding formula, a funding system that is so complicated and so difficult to understand, it is one of the reasons why you can have a state that's seemingly spending a lot of money but not getting a lot of results for it. One of the ways to really drive up efficiency and improve student learning is to have a basic student-centered funding formula where the money is clearly understandable, it's flexible, and there's accountability for results. Again, we have the report online. There's a lot more detail. I can answer additional questions afterwards, but I'm just happy to kind of provide that overview and look forward to hearing more about your understandings. Thank you.